Yes, Angus, I'll deal with that point first. I'd like to comment on the very interesting presentation from John. I think on the phase 3 of the EU emissions trading system, it is clear that logically, since EU GDP is now substantially below where it was predicted to be when the phase 3 caps were set, the argument for reducing those caps before phase 3 starts in 2013 is a very strong one. And I don't think anyone really tries to defeat it. The problem is the mechanism for doing so, and certainly when I was discussing this last week with the European Commission, they would be delighted to see the cap tightened, but it is something which requires unanimity. And the chances of all 27 countries, including in particular I think some countries in East and Central Europe, agreeing to that, given their current energy mix, is very remote indeed. So I fear we're going to be stuck with a phase 3 of the EU ETS, which certainly in its first half will not produce a carbon price anywhere near high enough to drive low carbon investment, which is why we need some other policy instruments to back it up. I thought the presentation was extremely interesting. I have to confess to a slight cynicism about any projections over 40 years where most of the progress takes place in the second half. It's very easy to say, yes, everything's going to be fine by 2025 or 2030. And there were one or two quite substantial assumptions in there, most notably that carbon capture and storage will be available at a reasonably economic price. Nobody knows whether that's going to be true or not yet. We're all rather hoping it's going to be, and indeed I think it's the one technological breakthrough that is most urgently needed in this whole challenge. But we can't be certain. We can't be certain when, and we can't be certain at what price it will be available, and so that's a pretty hefty assumption to feed in as one of the drivers of rapid decarbonisation. I think the second area which is interesting is the view that we can achieve a huge increase in the contribution from renewables without any further subsidy after 2030. That is clearly possible, but it will depend, I think, on two things. One is a substantial cut in the cost of the existing renewable technologies, solar, to some extent wind, certainly some of the marine technologies, and perhaps developments in the waste-to-energy field, which I think is much underexploited at the moment, and even in specialist technologies like fuel cells. It may be that we will see a huge reduction in the cost, but again, we can't be absolutely sure about that. Obviously, as volumes grow, that helps to drive costs down, but it's going to need more than that, I suspect. And the other part of the assumption, if we're not going to have any subsidies for renewables or targets after 2030, is of course that the prices of alternative, and in particular the carbon price, has risen very substantially. That again may be true, but I just wanted to flag up what seemed to me rather key, and perhaps slightly, I think a long time ago when I worked in the government, when you were sent into the House of Commons to defend some indefensible position, and the civil servants would give you some arguments, and they'd say, admittedly, these do depend, Minister, on rather heroic assumptions. That is civil service code for saying there's actually not the remotest chance they'll ever be achieved. There's just one other dimension I'd like to bring into this, and that's the international one. We've talked mostly about the EU so far, but of course the EU, though it can be a leader, I hope it will be a leader, it can pioneer many of the policies and technologies that are needed. The EU can't deliver the global solution to climate change on its own. We do depend very much on what happens in North America, we depend increasingly on what happens in South America, but most of all we depend on what happens in the East. And I'd like just to drag in the question of China, where I believe that they are much more focused on this challenge than many people in the West actually believe. And I was in China about 2 weeks ago discussing these very issues again. The move towards low carbon energy in China is taking place quite quickly. Although, of course, there's a huge expansion in coal-fired power as well, because the energy demands are so enormous. If you think that an economy which is growing at 10% a year will be 4 times its present size in 14 years' time by 2024. That's an incredible change, and even though they're committed to improving the carbon, the energy intensity of their economy, the target for that is only a 45% reduction. So they're going to need more than twice as much energy in 14 years' time as they're currently consuming. I I think the interesting opportunity is for a link between the EU and China here. It is clear that the Chinese are seriously considering emissions trading, and we may well see when the 12th five-year plan comes out in the spring a commitment on emissions trading. I think there's an enormous opportunity for the EU, which has currently the only international system, to be at least informally linked with the Chinese system. I think if that was to happen, the spur on the Americans to move faster on emissions trading than the present Congress is likely to do in the next 2 years, I think that spur would become enormous. So I think there's a very interesting international dimension, particularly in the East, and particularly for the EU to take a lead in China and possibly in India as well.